I request everyone to please take their seats. I request everyone outside the hall to please move in for the second plenary session of the Delhi Dialogue 11. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, and the Research and Information System for Developing Countries, I extend a warm welcome to everyone this morning to the second plenary session of the 11th Delhi Dialogue on Indo-Pacific Construct, Emerging Architecture. For this session, I would like to invite on stage the chair for the session, Ambassador Dr. T.C.A. Raghavan, Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs, and the panelists for the session, Dr. Alyssa Ayres, Senior Fellow, Council on Foreign Relations, Washington, D.C., Dr. David Brewster, Senior Research Fellow, National Security College, ANU College of Asia and the Pacific, Canberra, Dr. William Choong, Shangri-La Dialogue, Senior Fellow for Asia-Pacific Security, IISS, Singapore. Dr. Tomohiko Satake, National Institute for Defense Studies, Tokyo. Professor Dmitry Mosyakov, Institute of Oriental Studies, Russian Academy of Sciences, Moscow. Over to the chair for the session, Ambassador Raghavan, to conduct the session. Sir.
Well, the first question which arose was, should we speak from here or from the lectern? So it is open to each of the panelists to do whatever they are comfortable with. Thank you very much. Good morning. Early Saturday morning, but I'm happy to see so many people here to discuss emerging architectures for the Asia, for the Indo-Pacific. And may I say I'm very gratified to be part of such a distinguished panel with experts from different geographies, different countries, to reflect on this theme of what are the emerging architectures. Now, we are all aware in the last decade and a half, the Indo-Pacific has received a great deal of scholarly, analytical, as also policy attention. And we are also all aware that in the context of India and the Indo-Pacific, this attention really began when the Prime Minister of Japan had visited India in 2005 or 2006 I think, and referred to the co-joining of the two seas, using the analogy of a medieval Mughal manuscript, which had also talked about two seas coming together, although the context in which that manuscript was written was something quite different. But nevertheless, the idea of the Indo-Pacific has gained a great deal of traction. There is this debate about whether it is a vision, whether it is a concept, whether it is an approach, whether it is a doctrine, whether it is a strategy. And inevitably, there are different views about this fundamental question of what does the Indo-Pacific mean and what does it constitute. There are also inevitably differences between different countries, and now we have a whole range of opinions which have emerged about the Indo-Pacific from the United States, from Japan, from Australia, from ASEAN, from Singapore, from India, from Indonesia, and others, about what constitutes the Indo-Pacific. And there are very wide variations in these different approaches. In the US approach, to put it most simplistically, the Indo-Pacific extends from Hollywood to Bollywood, which is roughly to the western coast of the Indian subcontinent. In the Indian perspective, there is a wider expanse which is denoted by the term the Indo-Pacific, and these debates will continue in the discussions which we had in the preceding conference, the 6th Indian Ocean Dialogue. Some of these issues were gone into, and I do hope that in the Delhi Dialogue, these issues will be explored further. There are, of course, different perspectives, as I said, on how than previous analytical and theoretical and political constructs. From the Indian perspective, the idea of inclusivity is very important. And to some extent, this importance is derived from an older experience and an older memory of concepts and architectures which were constructed, which were essentially exclusive. And two which come to mind when we talk about the same region are ASEAN and APEC. Those were, of course, different from the Indo-Pacific, but the idea of, from an Indian perspective especially, I will emphasize this, the idea of inclusivity was not there in these constructs of the late 1980s and 1990s. Nevertheless, when we speak about emerging architectures or future architectures, what would be other notions which would inform such architectures? Which would be other norms which would inform such architectures? What would be the basis on which these architectures would be constructed, apart from the key notion of inclusivity? And I think one idea there which merits some discussion and some amount of research cutting across different countries is that of UNCLOS. What would be the role of UNCLOS in this emerging architecture of the Indo-Pacific? Now, to discuss these issues, and certainly there are many other issues which will also come up, we have a very distinguished panel, and I will ask each of them to speak on this subject. The ground rules are that each speaker will have about 10 to 12, 13 minutes, at the end of which we will have some questions, some time left for questions. But before I conclude, I would like to dwell on one particular aspect which interests me a great deal, which is about, from the Indian perspective again, the antecedents of the Indo-Pacific. Now, as I said, the idea of the Indo-Pacific has gained a great deal of traction in the past decade and a half. But there is, in fact, a much older analytical approach to what is now termed in the Indo-Pacific, and this was largely a historian's debate. What is happening now in India, and this is something I think audiences outside would find of some interest, is that the historians' debate is merging with the geopolitical and the foreign policy debate, and this congruence is something quite interesting. But what exactly are the antecedents of the Indo-Pacific? And really, if you look at the intellectual history of India in the early years of the 20th century, you find this great interest in the Indian Ocean and in the Pacific Ocean, and a number of intellectuals were at the head of this interest. So, for instance, in India, the first extensive use of the term Indo-Pacific was by a scholar by the name of Kalidas Nag, and he wrote a book in 1941, the title of which was India and the Pacific World. For him, the term referred to largely a single cultural and civilizational entity, and the impulse was to trace India's links with this vast maritime universe. And this had much to do with his association with India's great poet laureate in many ways, Rabindranath Tagore. And Tagore himself had visited the entire swath of the Indo-Pacific world, as we term it today, all across Southeast Asia, to Japan, to China, and elsewhere. Now, this impulse was also informed and was also further encouraged by a second stream of Indian endeavor and political activity, which was tracing the footsteps of indentured labor in the east coast of Africa, in South Africa, but also deep into the Pacific as far away as Fiji. So you had a number of Gandhian scholars going to these different countries, writing about the Indo-Pacific world, and the world they envisaged when they used the term Indo-Pacific really stretched all the way from the east coast of Africa to many of the Pacific islands. So this was a very vast geography. And today, of course, we would split this up in terms of the central Indo-Pacific, the eastern Indo-Pacific, and the western Indo-Pacific. But I find this historical debate and the way it is now influencing the geopolitical discussion in India about this term very interesting. So with these remarks, may I request our first speaker, Dr. Alyssa Ayres. She is Senior Fellow, Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C., and she is going to talk to us about a U.S. perspective on the Indo-Pacific. Yes, please.
Can everyone hear me okay? Is it? Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Raghavan, for setting us up for what I hope will be a very interesting conversation, again, about the geography of the Indo-Pacific and the concept itself. What does it mean? And thank you to the organizers for convening this discussion today. So let me talk a little bit about a United States perspective on the Indo-Pacific. The United States has begun to more fully embrace this concept, the concept of the Indo-Pacific itself. So as the United States has been talking more about this idea, the U.S. has been employing new language to highlight its priorities for, as Ambassador Raghavan said, a vast and expansive geographic space. What I think is a little bit less clear and remains a work in progress is whether the existing frameworks for coordination across this expansive space are right for the challenges ahead. So that's what I'd like to spend a few minutes on this morning, discussing some disjunctures in the definition itself of what constitutes the Indo-Pacific, the platforms that exist for coordination and the issues engaged, and what we ought to consider looking ahead. Let me start first with the geography. I'll springboard off of Ambassador Raghavan's initial remarks because I think that tees us up to talk about what really we're talking about when we talk about the Indo-Pacific. I've actually written elsewhere about the lack of a complete overlap among the geographic definitions employed by key Indo-Pacific nations. I think we should all, of course, speak about the concept itself, a framework first offered by Prime Minister Abe when he visited India. In fact, this idea of the confluence of the two seas was a framework that he offered in a speech before the Indian Parliament back in 2007. The idea of the free and open Indo-Pacific concept came slightly later, but again, that concept encompasses the entirety of the Indian and the Pacific Oceans. As Ambassador Raghavan mentioned to kick us off, India's concept of the Indo-Pacific appears quite similar, extending from the east coast of Africa to the west coast of the United States. So we see this concept has given way to a platform for coordination. For example, the Japan-India collaboration on the Asia-Africa Growth Corridor. That follows this precise mapping. Now, the United States follows a slightly different geographic understanding, I believe, frankly, for reasons relating to the historic nature of the geographic area covered by our military's former Pacific Command. It now has been renamed the Indo-Pacific Command. So when the US government talks about the Indo-Pacific as a region extending from Bollywood to Hollywood, that's a region that has been historically more centered on the Pacific Ocean without encompassing that maritime geography of the entirety of the Western Indian Ocean, let alone the East African coast. But let's take another example. I hope we'll hear a little bit more about this from Professor Brewster. But Australia is another country that is talking quite a bit about the importance of the Indo-Pacific for Australia's interests. Australia described the Indo-Pacific in its 2017 Foreign Policy White Paper as a region, quote, extending from the Eastern Indian Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, quote. Again, that apparently does not include the east coast of Africa. It extends somewhere from the middle of the Indian Ocean. My assessment is that over time, as concepts of the Indo-Pacific gain greater currency, these definitions of where the region begins and ends will probably need to acquire greater convergence, so we are all discussing the same region when we talk about the Indo-Pacific. But let's talk a little bit about priorities. What are the priorities for engagement in the Indo-Pacific? The term itself, I think, tends to connote maritime security, particularly freedom of navigation principles and images of naval exercises. These are, of course, the highest profile illustrations of military cooperation. And indeed, we have seen a shared emphasis among many Indo-Pacific nations on the importance of preserving a rules-based international order in the maritime context, again, specifically focused on preserving freedom of navigation and protecting the sea lanes. These are the core pillars of the free and open Indo-Pacific idea. Japan's elaboration of this concept elevates maritime peace and security, including humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. I would argue that there are also important civilian security concerns that a robust agenda for an Indian Ocean concept should incorporate, including on broad security coordination, on economic growth and prosperity, and on environmental priorities. In the security category, we should not lose sight of the civilian priorities such as cooperation on counterterrorism and countering violent extremism. This is a challenge in some form or another for many of the Indo-Pacific countries. Such a focus should include deepened conversations about terrorism designations and sanctions, as well as counter-terrorist financing. Closely related is the subject of what we in the United States refer to as homeland security. That's really an emphasis on fortifying oneself domestically, whether that's in terms of police training and capacity in our megacities, or at air, land, and seaports of entry. Collaboration on this set of issues requires mechanisms to engage national, state-level, and city-level law enforcement. That's the type of exchange that we are also seeing in the diplomatic world gain ground through new forms of paradiplomacy, engaging different levels of government across international boundaries. It's also worth underscoring the human security concerns. Those are global issues that have substantial impact on the Indo-Pacific region, such as refugees and also trafficking in persons. The Indo-Pacific region has some high-profile needs. For example, there are nearly 1 million Rohingya refugees essentially stranded in camps in Bangladesh without any guaranteed safe return to their homes. The South and Southeast Asian regions have large numbers of citizens who are guest workers abroad and at times are trapped, trafficked, or otherwise held against their will. In fact, this issue within the region led to the creation of a specific a dialogue process to focus on the issue, and I'll note that later when we talk about architectures that exist. I should also note that the rapid development of China's Belt and Road Initiative since 2013 has put connectivity and open markets on the international security agenda. The emerging problem of debt-trap diplomacy resulting from China's use of unsustainable loans to smaller countries that need the infrastructure but find themselves unable to afford repayments years later has spurred attention to infrastructure finance and sovereignty in economic statecraft. That's something today that has acquired a strategic dimension. The Indo-Pacific region also faces enormous and quite obvious risks from climate change. I cannot help but think that the growing urgency of tackling climate change will require a much more intensified level of international coordination, not only on the important issue of transitioning to renewables and reducing carbon emissions, which all must do faster, but also on the nuts and bolts of building greater resilience in our coastal areas as well as inland. The known major threats like sea level rise will put at peril populations in island nations and in low-lying regions. Here in South Asia, we've got the most famous climate vulnerable examples, Maldives and Bangladesh, and of course the lengthy Indian coastline. So best practices sharing on disaster risk reduction and disaster response can be a key element of Indo-Pacific concerns. Similarly, there is a real opportunity here to think through cooperation across this region on sustainability and agricultural adaptation. These are ways to adapt to greater or lesser rainfall, more variable climate, and more extreme weather events. In countries like India, more than half the population still makes a living on agriculture, so this becomes a massive economic security issue for the entire country. Would note the Rockefeller Foundation sponsored coordination with more than 100 major cities in the world to focus on building resilience. And the C40 network focused on climate change includes more than 30 cities in this larger Indo-Pacific region. The Indian Ocean region is already experiencing crises of cyclones, drought, sea level rise, crop destruction, and other climate-related challenges. So a way to boost the priority of this element and encourage faster action would be important to the entire region. I would note as well that on the overarching issue of economic growth and prosperity, we see very open markets and deeply interlinked economies across the Pacific part of the Indo-Pacific, but much less so in the Indian Ocean, and particularly the Western Indian Ocean part. So let me offer a few thoughts on advancing Indo-Pacific priorities amidst an array of partial institutional coverage. How can regional NATO ever come into being? The regional architecture that does exist has often been described as an alphabet soup. The existing architectures offer a patchwork that, like the non-overlapping definitions of Indo-Pacific, leaves some countries in and other countries out. The most institutionalized organizations were developed without a view to including the Indian Ocean, Western Indian Ocean part of the Indo-Pacific. The East Asia Summit, for example, is a very high visibility leader-level platform with concerns both strategic and economic, although it's not a military platform, but it does not extend to the east coast of Africa nor the Western Indian Ocean island nations. ASEAN has long been at the center of Asia-Pacific architectures, but ASEAN-centered consultations like the ARF similarly do not extend to their far west, to the Indian Ocean island nations, nor to the east coast of Africa, nor the Gulf. The premier economic-focused forum, APEC, is truly Asia-Pacific centered, not even extending its reach to South Asia. In fact, I've argued elsewhere that APEC ought to consider Indian membership. I've written about this for some years, and the fact that discussions have dragged on with no openness to new membership shows how difficult reformulating new membership and changing geographies of architectures can be. On the specifically military security focused side, there's the Western Pacific Naval Symposium, which covers the Pacific and includes India, Bangladesh, and Pakistan as observers, but not East Africa. Using the Western Pacific Naval Symposium as a blueprint, India created the Indian Ocean Naval Symposium, IONS. This includes East Africa, the Gulf, South and Southeast Asia, and Australia, but does not extend up to Northeast Asia, although China, Japan, and Russia are formally observers. The United States has participated in past gatherings, but is not a formal observer of the group. But these twin symposia, I think, show how a region-wide naval coordination mechanism is not yet there. There is no Indo-Pacific-wide consultation that specifically covers counterterrorism and countering violent extremism, a security concern that, as I mentioned, has a very strong law enforcement as distinct from military component. The finance ministries led financial action task force consultations, such as the Asia-Pacific Group on Money Laundering, covers a geography that looks like the US concept of the Indo-Pacific, incorporating the Asia-Pacific plus South Asia, but not the Western Indian Ocean and East Africa. Still, its substantial regional coverage offers a wide degree of coordination on a big swath of this area and has been operating well for years, so that's one model to look at. We've also seen, as mentioned earlier, a growing concern about the after effects of large infrastructure loans in the form of the Belt and Road financing, with Indo-Pacific countries like Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Maldives, and Pakistan prime examples of debt burdens so great countries have come under pressure, not always with desirable outcomes, such as the case of the Hambantota port. There is no specifically Indo-Pacific-wide architecture at present dealing with the precise issues raised by these concerns. Other lending institutions exist, of course, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, new banks such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. But the infrastructure needs are so great they cannot fill the gap alone. This is actually a discussion where we are seeing some nascent, what we would call mini-lateral cooperation, such as the formal coordination among the United States, Japan, and Australia on infrastructure support and financing. I wanted to also be sure to highlight the organization that I mentioned, created to address the migration and trafficking issues so important in this region. That's the Colombo process, closely with other UN bodies and regional organizations. These have many different, but no overarching region-wide architectures. APEC, for example, has prioritized enhancing trade in environmental goods. The East Asia Summit has had a long-standing emphasis on climate change for at least a decade. ASEAN established a working group on climate in 2009. The Indian Ocean Rim Association, IRA, has a blue economy and sustainability priority that encompasses that work. It's worth noting that IRA is an underdeveloped organization compared with those more institutionalized across the Pacific region. IRA has a forward-looking set of priorities and a membership that amply covers the Indian Ocean part of the Indo-Pacific, but not the Pacific part. So this is the exact converse of the APEC situation. Its declared priorities cover the kinds of important maritime security, human security, sustainability, economic development, and gender equity concerns that could serve as an ideal blueprint for a more institutionalized Indo-Pacific-wide coordination, should one ever become possible. Finally, we are seeing what appears to be an increase in trilateral and even quadrilateral consultations among Indo-Pacific countries, precisely on the slate of priorities noted earlier. These include groupings like, for example, the US-India-Japan trilateral, the India-Japan-Australia trilateral, and the revival of the the Quad, which brings together all 4 democracies together. Now that is a revival since 2017 in the civilian-led format, a civilian-led consultation, not a military coordination, as sometimes people assume. But with this array of partial geographies and institutions that partially cover the whole region, it takes on some but not all issues. Is it possible to envision something that is geographically inclusive, as Ambassador Raghavan noted to kick us off, geographically covering the entirety of the Indo-Pacific wide in the years ahead? There's been a very strong push of support for ASEAN to promote the rules-based international order and be the kind of fulcrum of discussions about the rules-based international order. I wonder if there's a way that ASEAN could formally partner with IRA, for example, to expand on occasion this geography to encompass the confluence of the 2 seas. Or is coordinating at that level across this geography too complicated? Is it feasible? A fully region-wide architecture for the Indo-Pacific will likely require some kind of flexible coordination among the existing organizations, if not a formal agreement to advance goals in parallel, if it is to realize that kind of broad, inclusive coordination across the entirety of the space in the years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very interesting paper, and in particular for focusing on the contrast between the density of intergovernmental associations and organizations in the Eastern Indian Ocean and their relative absence in the Western Indian Ocean. Our next speaker is Dr. David Brewster, who is Senior Research Fellow with the National Security College, Australian National University.
Okay, yes, great, thanks. So, good morning. So today I'm going to talk about some ideas about the future security architecture or architectures for the Indo-Pacific region. And the starting point for all of this is an understanding of how the Indo-Pacific is likely to become a much more complex, congested, contested, and multipolar space. And that sort of understanding of the strategic future of the Indo-Pacific is really fundamental to understanding what future security architectures are going to look like. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about definitions of regions, and I think Dr. Ayres made some excellent points there, other than to say that I certainly see the starting point that the Indo-Pacific is a region. And however you might define that region, countries will have different definitions, and those definitions may or may not coalesce, but they will certainly evolve, and they'll evolve to include regions which become of interest for particular reasons. And so, for example, perhaps a little while ago, many people might not have thought that the South Pacific was part of the Indo-Pacific, and all the South Pacific Islands. But certainly within Australia, there's a strong view that the South Pacific Islands form part of the Indo-Pacific, and that's really driven by developments in strategic competition between a number of major powers. So putting that aside, the geographical definition of the Indo-Pacific, it's a region, and overlaid across that region, on top of that region, can be a variety of security architectures. And jumping to my final conclusion, in my view, the diversity and size of the Indo-Pacific makes an overarching security architecture unlikely and unworkable. And instead, there'll be a complex web of security relationships which allow countries to come together for different and specific reasons. It's going to be a lot messier than many people might expect. So let me start with saying a few words about some of the strategic changes we're seeing across the Indo-Pacific. And there are a lot of drivers for this, and these include relative decline in US power, relative rise in Chinese power, the emergence of India as a major regional power. Also the changing roles of middle and small states in the security world, and I'll come back to all of this later. Finally, the impact of climate change. We should not underestimate the likely impact of this. Someone said to me yesterday that climate change could well become the new superpower in terms of strategic dynamics. Okay, let me just go through those points one by one. I'm not going to really spend much time on the relative changes in balance of power between the United States, China and India. We'll all here be very, very familiar with all of that. We've been talking about that for a decade or more. Suffice it to say, I'll make one point. Although the Indo-Pacific can be seen as a sort of a relatively cohesive strategic space between the Indian and Pacific Oceans, we also have to acknowledge and be aware that there are somewhat different dynamics occurring in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, different players, different issues, and so that necessarily drives what security architectures might look like. But it's not just about the major powers. The development of the Indo-Pacific towards a more multipolar region really enhances the roles of middle powers in particular. And we are seeing at the moment many middle powers finding good reasons to hedge their relationships and find alternatives to just relying on the United States as a security provider, as they did in previous decades. And this is why we're seeing middle powers such as Australia, France and Japan and others becoming much more active than at any time in living memory in trying to build new relationships and structures across the region. And as time goes on, they're going to be joined by a number of other middle powers. It's potentially a long list: Indonesia, for example, Bangladesh, for example, South Korea, and many others, who will find good reasons to become much more active in building these relationships. And in my view, in some ways, they may become the key drivers in building new security architectures across the region. And I'll come back to this a bit later to give some examples. Now, the smaller and weaker countries also have very important roles to play in terms of building new architectures. Some small states are likely to become, frankly, the battlegrounds for strategic competition among the major powers, and others will try to find new ways to shelter themselves from this strategic competition. And we've seen a number of examples of this happening in recent years. I would say Sri Lanka would be one example of a country that's found itself in many ways as a battleground between major powers. And I think there are many other smaller or weaker states that will similarly find themselves in that position, and it will happen with greater frequency. You can be assured of that. So what do small countries do? They can attempt to avoid the impact of strategic competition by declaring themselves non-aligned or neutral, while others might try to build new multilateral groupings to bring themselves together and to balance against the larger powers. Now, in my view, a new non-aligned movement is very unlikely in the coming period of major power competition, but certainly we could see other types of groupings of smaller states in ways that we can't necessarily guess at the moment. So that's the dynamics, but let me talk a bit more specifically about the potential impact of these changes in the strategic environment on new strategic architectures in the Indo-Pacific. Now, the starting point for this is really there is currently no meaningful strategic architecture that spans the entire Indian Ocean. Although some Asia-Pacific centred institutions, such as the EAS and ARF, have been in recent years expanded to include some Indian Ocean states, in reality these institutions pay very, very little attention to the problems of the Indian Ocean and are frankly poorly suited to deal with issues in this part of the world. And in my view, it would be a mistake to try and rely on those institutions to try and address challenges in the Indian Ocean, for example. Nor do I think that we can realistically expect to see a new broad-based security mechanism that spans the entire Indo-Pacific. The region is just too big and too diverse to realistically think that such an institution could function. And I specifically used the word broad-based because, in fact, there is one institution that currently does span almost the whole of the Indo-Pacific region, and that is the regional grouping of Coast Guards, the heads of Asian Coast Guards meeting. And that's interesting because it's a grouping that functions on a specific issue or among specific institutions, and it functions reasonably well. So that may be a pointer to how we can build institutions that address certain issues or agencies. And I'll come back to this later with some other suggestions on this. So despite this general lack of a overarching strategic architecture across the Indo-Pacific, the developments in the strategic environment that I noted a few minutes ago are in fact leading to a lot of developments in the security architecture in the region, and in fact middle powers are playing a really key role in this. So, and I'll give you a few different sorts of examples of how this can play out. So in the past, many countries in the Indo-Pacific relied on their security relationship with the United States as part of the so-called hub and spokes alliance system. But we're now seeing much closer relationships between US alliance partners to, in effect, join the spokes of that system together. And one very good example is the increasingly close security relationship between Japan and the United States, which, if you go back 10 or 20 years, really had very little direct security relationship, and now it's quite a close security relationship. Another trend is for closer bilateral security relationships between US alliance partners and non-traditional US alliance partners, and I think a good example of that, for example, is the increasingly close security relationship between France and India. Yet a third trend, and this was mentioned by Dr. Ayres, is towards the establishment of minilateral, what's called minilateral dialogues involving small and informal groupings of states that share common interests. And these groupings are really now quite nascent, but they do provide valuable forums for discussion of issues that could ultimately evolve into new security structures and perhaps even the building blocks for a new security architecture. So, for example, for some years, Australia, India and Japan have undertaken regular trilateral dialogue at the foreign security level, and which has been ultimately really a very, very useful mechanism. An interesting Indian Ocean triangle is between Australia, India and Indonesia, which have been holding senior officials meetings for about 1 or 2 years now on shared interests in the Indian Ocean, including concerns about China's actions in the South China Sea and other issues such as illegal fishing. Yet another minilateral dialogue is the so-called Quad between Australia, India, Japan and the United States. Now, I don't want to emphasise this, and frankly where that grouping will lead is rather uncertain, but it's more than possible for that structure to gain in substance and also ultimately involve other countries as well. It's not just, there's nothing set in stone about 4 is good, and there's a good reason to believe that that may be expanded to include other countries such as France and others. But the overriding value of these minilateral structures are really their informality and their looseness. So they can provide an excellent signalling function without necessarily binding their members, and also a useful way of coordinating responses of their members to specific issues. These minilateral structures also provide useful ways for middle and smaller powers, to band together to increase their bargaining power vis-a-vis larger powers and try and mitigate some of the adverse effects of strategic competition. So let me come back to something I mentioned a few minutes ago, and that is the relative success of HAGM, Heads of Asian Coast Guard meeting, in terms of providing a grouping, a forum for Coast Guards in the region, spreading all the way from the Korean Peninsula right across the Asian littoral. I think one of the most recent members is Turkey. So that provides a valuable forum for these Coast Guards to come together to talk about issues of shared concern in terms of crime, transnational security issues, provide mutual support and training, etc. And so I would suggest that another opportunity, if we are looking to try to build one by one institutions which have a pan-Indian Ocean view, is climate change. I mentioned that climate change is likely to become one of the big gorillas of the Indian Ocean, almost a superpower in itself in terms of the challenges that it's going to present to us all. And we really need to start thinking about structures that bring together countries and civil and military agencies to talk about ways to deal with the security impact of climate change and look at ways of mitigating those security impacts. I'm impressed that currently there is a Pacific Environmental Security Forum sponsored by Indo-Pacific, but nevertheless it brings together, I think, countries from all over the region in a pretty non-political and cooperative manner, both military and civil agencies, to talk about ways of, or really to develop shared understandings of the security threats coming from climate change. And in my view, there's certainly room for a similar forum which spans right across the Indo-Pacific. Now, that's just one example that I give, but I give it specifically because you know, I think that we should move away from trying to develop some grand overarching security architecture across the Indo-Pacific, at least for the moment, because it's really just too hard. And if we do want to develop pan-regional security mechanisms, we should perhaps be careful in selecting particular agencies such as Coast Guards or particular issues in which we can develop shared understandings across the region. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Brewster. Very interesting point about the Coast Guard and addressing climate change. Thank you for that presentation. Our next speaker is Dr. William Choong, who helps run the annual IISS Shangri-La dialogue.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And first off, good morning, everyone, and thanks for inviting me to the Ministry of External Affairs and IISS for bringing me all the way here to Delhi. The fact that I'm first time here in Delhi speaking at the Delhi dialogue shows, you know, the rather expanding definition of the Indo-Pacific. I want to speak on 4 points today, and I hope to do it within 10 minutes. I'm going to talk about 4 points. One is what I can interpret to be the Indo-Pacific concept that's been outlined by what I call the Indo-Pacific Four, which is Australia, India, Japan, and the United States. Divergences within the Indo-Pacific Four as to the definition of the Indo-Pacific and how this gels with ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And my last point will be on India and the Indo-Pacific and the implications of India's recent withdrawal from the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Now, on the Indo-Pacific concept itself, like Chairman Raghavan was saying and Alyssa was saying, the Indo-Pacific concept is not a new one. And I think many Indians, like Alyssa would say, way back in 2007, Shinzo Abe was here addressing your parliament about what he called a dynamic coupling of the Indian and Pacific Oceans. The Indo-Pacific concept died a premature death in 2007 when Australia withdrew from the so-called Quad because of pressure from China. But in recent years, we've seen the concept make a comeback. So from my vantage point at the Shangri-La dialogue, I did kind of a word search. In the 2017 Shangri-La dialogue, there were 5 mentions of the term Indo-Pacific. And in 2018 itself, there were 92 mentions of the term Indo-Pacific. And Jim Mattis, the US Secretary of Defense, mentioned it 26 times. So this is what happens to you when you're too involved in a dialogue. You start counting the number of mentions of a certain term. I'll just fast forward to what I call to be the promise and potential of the Indo-Pacific concept being advocated by Australia, Japan, India, and the United States, in that it's a sophisticated way of actually advocating a regional order, and you could call it a subtle push at China and some aspects of Beijing's assertive behavior, in particular in the South China Sea. And I wouldn't even call it the Abe Doctrine, but I think the way Shinzo Abe sketched it out at the Shangri-La dialogue in 2014 was quite clever, because he used the term that regional order should be based on 3 rule of law principles. And he says it has to be based on the rule of international law, no recourse to the use of force, and freedom of navigation. And he applied this to the South China Sea disputes that we see with China right now. But if it doesn't take a rocket scientist, in fact, it doesn't even take a political scientist to figure out that this was a clever pushback against China's actions in the South China Sea. And you see this kind of Abe ideas filtering out into the concepts being encapsulated in the free and open Indo-Pacific that we see today being pushed by the US, Australia, Japan, and India. And moving on to my second point, we see clear divergences within the Indo-Pacific 4 as to what the Indo-Pacific actually means. So is that anecdote about 10 blind men feeling different parts of an elephant. So I think Alyssa sketched it out, David sketched it out. There are differences about what geographical definition the Indo-Pacific actually means. But I want to really focus on kind of clear divergences within the Indo-Pacific 4 as to when it comes to managing the threat of China or the challenge of China. We can see that Japan and the United States have been quite strident and direct in trying to use the free and open Indo-Pacific concept as a pushback against China. I think the United States has made it very clear in its 2017 National Security Strategy that China is a revisionist power, and only in June this year, the Pentagon was saying in its Indo-Pacific Strategic Report that China is undermining the values and principles of the international rules-based order. Whereas Australia and India tend to be a bit more sanguine in terms of using FOIP to challenge China. India, of course, we know that Prime Minister Modi spoke at the Shangri-La dialogue in 2018, talking about civilizational linkages between India and Southeast Asia. And Prime Minister Modi used the term, quote unquote, free, open, and inclusive. And I think he used it like 3 to 5 times. And it was a clear indication, that India doesn't have a kind of exclusive approach to the free and open Indo-Pacific. Moving on to my third point, which is the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific. And I'm Singaporean born and bred, and I'm part of ASEAN, so I think I can speak my mind on AOIP. I see the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific as a vanguard action to assert ASEAN centrality. Because those with longer historical memories among us will remember an idea pitched by Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd in 2009, where he talked about the Asia-Pacific community. And that involved 6 countries, US, China, Japan, India, Indonesia, and Russia. But the APC, as we know it, did not engender ASEAN involvement. So we all knew where the APC went. It was consigned to the dustbin of history, if you like, because ASEAN wasn't included. So I would say that the ASEAN outlook on the Indo-Pacific is kind of ASEAN putting its imprimatur, on a concept that has gained a lot of traction, a lot of airtime in the past 3 to 5 years. I would say, that there are motherhood statements inside the AOIP that nobody can disagree with, right? We're talking about building an environment that supports international law, economic growth centers, transparency, and inclusiveness. Nobody would have a debate about these principles. But I think a more interesting point is that even within ASEAN, other than the fact that all 10 members have actually signed off on the document, there is no clear kind of acceptance on the document, and I can show you the evidence. It was Malaysian Foreign Minister Saifuddin Abdullah, quoted on Twitter, mind you. He was speaking to the media, and he was saying, quote unquote, "I'm not particularly impressed by the Indo-Pacific concept that was signed off by ASEAN." And I can show you the Twitter link to this. And he says that Malaysia signed off on the AOIP more because of ASEAN unity rather than any excitement about what AOIP really means. And I'll just leave that to you. And also I think that it is a vanguard action because ASEAN really fears that, any overriding concepts are dictated and defined to it by external powers. And I used the example of APC earlier. And I would quote Singapore's long-serving Permanent Secretary of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Bilahari Kaushkan, where he says that, major powers only profess ASEAN centrality only when it suits their interests. And such powers consider ASEAN central not because of ASEAN's strategic heft, but ASEAN. My last point is on India, Act East, Look East, and the free and open Indo-Pacific. I've mentioned about what Modi said at the Shangri-La dialogue in 2018 about civilizational linkages between India and Southeast Asia. And I think that India's inclusion into the RCIP was an excellent idea. It's a commendable enterprise, so it's really regrettable that India withdrew from the RCEP. What it does show, and disagree with me if you like, I think that the RCEP withdrawal means that India's foreign policy objectives has actually overtaken your domestic economic imperatives, and I fully agree. I fully can understand, why India withdrew from the RCEP, and I can even say that, ASEAN working with the other 5 partners in the RCEP now can push forward the RCEP, and they're thinking of signing it in 2020 and maybe even trying to get India back again into RCEP sometime in the future. But my parting shot is that this doesn't do very well for the advancement of the Indo-Pacific concept. And my second point is that it actually gives China a kind of an on-ramp into defining what the Indo-Pacific is. Because without India in the equation, China sees an opportunity in defining the Indo-Pacific, and ASEAN has already laid it out very clearly, that the Indo-Pacific is open, is inclusive, it will focus on developments to that. But I think India really needs to be back in defining and advocating the definition of the Indo-Pacific, and I'll leave it at that. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Very thought-provoking remarks, and in particular, thank you for reminding us about the ASEAN centrality and the Kevin Rudd background, but also thank you for your very interesting remarks about the RCEP, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of discussion about that during the course of the day. Our next speaker is Dr. Tomohiko Satake.
Well, thanks, Chair, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very traditional and important dialogue. It seems I'm the only public servant in this panel, but nevertheless, what I'm going to say has nothing to do with official viewpoint of the Japanese government or NIDS, which means that I can be more provocative than ordinary Japanese public servant. Anyway. I'd like to explain my personal interpretation of Japan's vision for free and open Indo-Pacific, or FOIP, which was announced by Prime Minister Shinzo Abe in August 2016. And let me begin with asking one question. Is this FOIP concept really new or not. Surely the term Indo-Pacific as a geographical concept is new. I understand that this concept is invented by Australia or United States rather than invented by Japan. But nevertheless, if you look at the substance or contents of FOIP, such as the freedom of navigation, the rule of law, free trade and connectivity, and blah, 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 these are nothing new. Japan has pursued free and open Indo-Pacific for many years since the end of the World War II. Let's say freedom of navigation, for example. Japan is a country surrounded by seas. And, of course, it lacks natural resources. And nearly, almost all natural resources comes from the seaborne trade. And that's the reason why Japan has strongly supported the freedom of navigation and the rule of law at sea. Simply put, Japan cannot survive without free and open Indo-Pacific. The United States can survive, maybe, and China can survive without free and open Indo-Pacific if it can successfully solve the Malacca dilemma issues, but Japan cannot. So my understanding is that rather than inventing something new, FOIP just reconfirms and reinvigorates what Japan has been doing over the past decades. Now, if that is the case, why does the Japanese government stress it right now? That's simply because Japan's desirable international order has been increasingly undermined by the changing power balance in the region. Japanese policymakers are increasingly concerned about China's unilateral change of the status quo by force in both East and South China Sea, which is an apparent challenge against the freedom of navigation and peaceful resolution of conflicts. Economic corruption, political interference, and cyber or espionage activity, these are all important challenges against the so-called rules-based international order. Japan basically welcomes Chinese BRI project. That's fine, but also increasingly concerned with many problems or issues such as transparency, sustainability, and also environmental concern, and so on. So unless Japan strengthens its regional engagement, Japan's past efforts would likely to become nothing. So this is the general feeling shared by Japanese policymakers right now, and this is a fundamental motivation why Japan pursues free and open Indo-Pacific right now. I think it's a kind of long-term and more structural response to the current geopolitical reality rather than Prime Minister Abe's personal initiatives. Now, some people say that FOIP is simply a geopolitical or geo-economic strategy in order to contain China. But I don't think that's true. Well, first of all, Japan has maintained some constructive engagement policy with China through diplomatic and economic measures. And as a result of that, we actually agreed that Japan-China relations return to a normal state, completely return to a normal state. And we now resume some defense exchange with China, such as mutual port visits or educational exchanges and so on. So unlike geopolitics or geo-economical strategy, which is purely exclusive and competitive, I think Japan's policy under FOIP includes both cooperative and competitive aspects. Rather than directly targeting at a particular country, Japan aims at enhancing the resiliency and connectivity of the region so that the region can successfully accommodate the rise of China in the future. So FOIP is for something, not against something. And Japan also encourages regional countries' sustainable economic growth based on the principle of self-help so that these countries can become more independent, rather than dependent on a particular country. Japan, of course, has many territorial disputes in surrounding regions, but it has never tried to change the status quo by force, by sending, those ships or militarizing those islands and so on. Now, the so-called economic statecraft, the use of economic measures to achieve a diplomatic purpose, has been increasingly popular in Japan right now, but also, Japan has carefully avoided the violation of free trade and refrain from the so-called trade embargo or economic coercion against countries. So I think the fundamental purpose of this FOIP is not to exclude a particular country, but to incorporate all countries under common rules, norms, and standards. Japan's continuous and constructive engagement with China is only possible under such a stable and inclusive framework as to prevent the emergence of a rising power by all necessary measures, which is often referred as a Thucydides trap. So in order to avoid this hegemonic war, in order to escape from this Thucydides trap, we must find a broader space that can accommodate both the rising power and the declining hegemon. And I think expanding this geopolitical scope from Asia-Pacific to Indo-Pacific is a kind of attempt to find and create a broader strategic space in the region. Unlike Asia-Pacific, where the US has been the dominant economic and military power, Indo-Pacific features more diverse actors such as Japan, India, Australia, ASEAN, and some extra regional countries such as the UK and France. So although FOIP is nothing new, I think the path FOIP itself will lead to the emergence of a more multipolar Asia that is different from the past US-centric order. And I think Japan's cooperation with ASEAN as well as India is essentially important in this multipolar Indo-Pacific. Because if you understand FOIP as simply a geopolitical or geoeconomic strategy, there's not so much ASEAN can do in such a competitive game. But if you understand FOIP as a regional order building rather than geopolitical or geoeconomic strategy, I think ASEAN becomes the center of this regional order building strategy under FOIP. And this is not only because of ASEAN's geography, which links between Indian Ocean and Pacific, but also because of its role to maintain inclusive and rules-based international order through multilateral institutions such as APEC, ARF, ADMM+, and East Asian Summit, and so on. ASEAN has been also the center of regional integration and promotion of free trade. And of course, ASEAN is vital for the success of RCEP, along with other players such as Japan, Australia, and India. Japan also supports Mekong-India Economic Corridor, which could yield greater benefits to ASEAN with strong connectivity with India. And most importantly, Japan and ASEAN share some important principles or norms, such as support for free and open rules-based order, a peaceful resolution of conflicts, complementarity, ASEAN's unity and its centrality, and inclusiveness. And if that is the case, I think Japan's cooperation with ASEAN to achieve free and open Indo-Pacific will become even more important in the foreseeable future. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Satake, for that very interesting and thoughtful presentation. Our last speaker is Professor Dmitry Mosyakov. The floor is yours, sir.
So thank you for invitation to come to this, to the organizers of the conference, to come to this great scientific event. It was a long journey from Moscow, but I think it can be very useful, and it's great to be here. And I want to say some words on Russian position on all the events in this vast region. Today in Russia, we can see serious discussions about the future of the Indo-Pacific region. The reason for this is clear. It is obvious that the process of creation of Indo-Pacific construct acts as the defining core of the entire changing system of international relations in the Pacific and Indo-Pacific Asia. There is no doubt that the ongoing changes open up new opportunities for the countries of the region, but also create new threats. Today it is not yet clear what will be more, new opportunities or new threats. Everything will depend on how and in what direction the events will develop. The problem is that in Washington plan to build the Indo-Pacific as a kind of a military bloc. If we look on the boundaries of the Indo-Pacific region marked by the Americans, we find that the boundaries almost completely coincide with the areas of responsibility of the Pacific Command of the United States. This confirms you see, declaration of American politicians that military objectives were key in the development of the plan of the Indo-Pacific region. As about Russia, we can see that the whole territories of Northeast Asia remain outside the borders of the Indo-Pacific construct. That Russia is outside of the Indo-Pacific political map in American plans, and under the threat that its considerable achievements in the development of cooperation and with the regional countries and the Russian presence in the various spheres are under real threat. We can see that there is another important condition for participation in the Indo-Pacific project. According to the Americans, only those countries that are called democratic by their own standards can participate in it. It is clear that this condition was introduced in order to prevent the possibility of Chinese participation in the future of Indo-Pacific construct. But this condition and de facto exclusion of China immediately generates tension and confrontation in the region and complicates opportunities for compromise and for mutually beneficial cooperation between all parties. It is obvious that all countries of the Asia-Pacific and Indo-Pacific regions are interested in economic development, cooperation, and security. To act by the method of exclusion and confrontation is not the road to this noble task. Now we can see two alternatives about the future of the vast region of Indo-Pacific. And these two variants differ most significantly from each other. I mean American vision on the one side and the vision of India and ASEAN countries on the other side. Their positions are very close. And how these two visions will interact in the future is not entirely clear. American interests, I think, that contradict the wish of India and ASEAN countries turning international competition into international cooperation. Moreover, the key principles of the organization and functioning of ASEAN, sovereign equality, non-interference, non-use of force, mutual support, a central role in Asian politics, are very weakly combined with aggressiveness approaches with the primacy of ideology that we can see as the foundation for American plans. ASEAN countries, which at a meeting in Bangkok in June 2019 approved their vision of this project, are completely in solidarity with the position of India regarding the future format in which integration should take place. The geostrategic concept of the Indo-Pacific region adopted by them states that ASEAN countries confirm their centrality, inclusiveness, order based on rules and international law, and commitment to promote economic cooperation in the region. I hope even now there is still a possibility that there will be a process to form a common vision on the future of the Indo-Pacific construct, which can use the proposition of India and ASEAN countries and would occupy an important place. But there are many, can be a situation that the United States will impose its vision in all other participants of this project. Naturally, between these two projects, Russia is really to support the Indian and ASEAN vision of the future, as it is as close as possible to the vision of future of Asia that is in Moscow. We believe that the voice of India should be particularly weighed as it is clear that the Americans will never be able to build an Indo-Pacific construct without the participation of India. Among some Russian experts, there are some views that the project of open and free Indo-Pacific is not suitable for us, not to take part in this project at all. But I think that we have another point of view, and this idea undermines such a global Russian project as the concept of Greater Eurasia. You see, I think that the Indo-Pacific construct in Indian and ASEAN version is very close to Russian understanding, to Russian vision of future of Asia as Greater Eurasia. Greater Eurasia is the idea to form around Russia, not only around Russia, in Eurasia, to form in Eurasia a kind of global space with more or less general rules in trade and investments from the European Union to ASEAN countries, that is from Western Europe to Southeast Asia. The political foundation of the project will be the principles of peace, stability, justice, and mutual trust that are very close to our partners in India and ASEAN countries. It also includes the principle of connectivity as the vital part of the policy in Asia, where no one dictates values between connected countries. The project of Greater Eurasia is designed for the long term and is largely decisive for Russian efforts in Asia, as it involves huge areas of peace, prosperity, and cooperation. Progress on this path, in my opinion, can be closely linked with the Indo-Pacific project only if it will be developed in the framework of the Indian-ASEAN political initiatives. It should also be said that for Moscow it's very important that the potential Indo-Pacific construct participants, and first of all India, do not see the reasons why Russia cannot participate in this project. Thus, the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, regarding the prospects for the development of Indo-Pacific construct, stated that India does not consider the Indo-Pacific region as a closed club with a limited number of members. It includes all countries within its geography, as well as other countries who are interested in this. So that in the end I can see that we can see the common base for Russian interest, Indian interest, and ASEAN interest for the future of Indo-Pacific. And we're interested to support the activities of India and ASEAN countries to promote their plans for the future of Indo-Pacific. And I think that Russia should respond on this request. We can see this request from India and ASEAN countries for Russian support to implement their ideas, their vision of the future. And I think that Russia should respond to this request and put its weight in favor of Indian and ASEAN countries' visions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor, for a very interesting talk, and also for drawing our attention to the connection with Eurasia. Recently, our Prime Minister was in Vladivostok. We started late, so I'm taking the liberty of extending our session by a few minutes more so that we have some time for questions. May I ask questions to be brief, and please identify yourself. Yes, sir, at the back. And we'll take 3 questions together.
I have 2 questions, one to the Singapore participant.
So if you could identify yourself.
Oh, I'm Professor Baladas Ghoshal, a former professor from Jawaharlal Nehru University and now Secretary General, Society for Indian Ocean Studies. Now, one question to Singapore participant. Would you agree with the view that ASEAN construct of Indo-Pacific is almost rewriting BRI, Belt and Road Initiative? That is one question to him. And another question to the entire panel. What would you describe Indo-Pacific in one word? Is it a vision, a dream that everyone wants to attain, knowing fully well that all the 4 variables, open, rule-based order, then inclusive and free, they're all problematic. There are no agreements on those 4 issues. Then just one comment, that is, the security architecture of Asia cannot be based on any one concept. It has to be based on a wave of various arrangements, which David had sort of mentioned in terms of plurilateral arrangements. It is the only way that you can connect to various sort of conceptual things, and some kind of peace and stability could be achieved on those bases.
Thank you. Ambassador Rajiv Bhatia, former Director General, Indian Council of World Affairs and former Ambassador to Myanmar.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'll have very quick two questions, one to Alyssa and one to David. But please allow me to make just one brief comment, and this is that everybody has spoken about this dichotomy between inclusivity and exclusivity, which you had highlighted right in the beginning. As we see it, I think it is part of the picture. Both exist there, probably inclusivity at the idealistic level and exclusivity at the realistic level. I think we would probably agree on that portrayal. Alyssa, thank you very much for a very comprehensive list of priorities. But there was a notable omission, and I would like to understand why. I'm referring to the growing importance and the traction that blue economy has received in this region. It is there in East Africa, it is there in South Asia, BIMSTEC, it is there in ASEAN, and it is figuring all the time in the statements of Indo-Pacific leaders. Even in US, it is a big issue. So is it not possible for you to consider including blue economy as yet another priority in the Indo-Pacific region today? And David, thank you very much for bringing this very creative idea of building some institutional base for Indo-Pacific. And in that context, may I make a suggestion? Because yesterday ministers are asking for suggestions and recommendations. The suggestion is that this entire Indo-Pacific region should, in our view, have an Indo-Pacific think tank network, IPTTN, backed by the foreign ministries. It doesn't have to be from every country of the region that has to be represented here. It could be started off as a core mechanism. In a way, we are seeing the science of that core mechanism sitting right here on this panel. So what do you think of this idea of Indo-Pacific think tank network backed by the foreign ministries, so that we stop just keep defining and redefining Indo-Pacific, but start taking some concrete initiatives? Thank you so much, Chair.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Yes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Prateek. I'm a consultant with the Foreign Service Institute, MEA. My question is to Dr. Alyssa Ayres. Ma'am, I wanted your analysis on the latest remarks by Assistant Secretary Stilwell on India, China, and international affairs, where he referred to US policy now being pluralistic in the region, that US has traditionally supported multipolarity, and countries will not have to make a choice between India and China in the region. China and US in the region.
We'll take one more question, right at the back, yes.
Good morning. My name is Deepak Krishnadas, and I'm a researcher of international relations at the South Asian University. So my question is to Dr. Ayres. So when we talk about, just a comment on the BRI, when we talk about the debt trap diplomacy and the financing done by China, see, one of the main reasons even cited by most of these countries who have fallen in such kind of a debt trap is the lack of other feasible alternative mechanism. So now when the United States itself is taking a relative, backward step, it puts, it kind of reinforces the conviction among these countries. Now, my question is related to the Chagos Archipelago case. So, despite an overwhelming ruling by the UNGA and the ICJ, the UK continues to be in odds with Mauritius related to that issue. Now, Mauritius, Australia, India, and all the other countries have realized the vital importance of Diego Garcia as a very strategic base in the Indian Ocean. And in that case, when Mauritius itself has conveyed that it is interested in having a long-term relation with the United States, there's not been much signals from Washington in this regard.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. So may I ask each of our panelists to comment very briefly on the questions raised and also on what was directed to you? And perhaps we could begin with you, Professor. Would you like to make any comments on the questions raised, but very briefly?
The question on the possibility of think tank?
Yes, yes.
Yes, I think it's a very good. It's a very good proposition. I think that we need how to say the second road that will support the activities of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of our countries, because the events in our region, and we can speak in Russia that the North Pacific and Pacific Ocean is our region also, so huge, so dangerous, so undeterminable that we have to speak about the possibilities of every road, how to make peace, how not to go to the new contradictions, how to find the ways for cooperation, for better future for all our countries. And I think that this think tank, on a regular basis, I think that with the scholars that connected with the Minister of Foreign Affairs that can prepare some papers, they can make some advice for the diplomats, it can be a very serious foundation for stable and prosperous world in the future. I think, thank you for this great proposition. I think it should be implemented and as soon as possible.
Thank you. Thank you. Dr. Satake, would you have any comments on the questions or anything?
Yeah, if I may, I mean, if I describe Indo-Pacific in a word, then that's a vision, I think. And then the important thing is whether or not we can share this vision. And in order to achieve this vision, there can be many different strategies or approaches. And some approaches can be exclusive, some approaches can be inclusive, that's fine. But most importantly, whether or not we can share this vision. And I think this kind of venue is really important for that kind of purpose.
Dr. Brewster.
Thanks. Yes, I'll just respond specifically on the Ambassador's suggestion about a network of think tanks. I think it's an excellent idea. I would go perhaps further and suggest that those think tanks could operate a Indo-Pacific version of CSCAP to have, encourage very, very regular consultations at a 1.5 track level. Now, I think my personal view is CSCAP has probably achieved what it needed to achieve for the Asia-Pacific in past years, but certainly for the Indo-Pacific as such, there's a gaping hole that sort of network could achieve in terms of bringing together regular consultations at a track 2 or track 1.5 level.
Doctor, there were 2 or 3 questions, and I think one in particular about the blue economy.
Yeah.
I thought it did figure, but perhaps you would like to clarify.
Yeah, just to note, I thought that's a great question and one that I think is quite important. I did refer in a couple sections of my initial remarks to the fact that you see far deeper economic integration across the Pacific part of this larger Indo-Pacific region. And we heard the further comments about India's decision not to join the RCEP, RCEP. When we think about the blue economy as a program of work or a concept for further economic development, there's a lot that's encompassed there. It encompasses fisheries issues, it encompasses tourism, it encompasses the whole range of economic engagement. I think that's a really important topic, actually. I did mention it as a priority that IRA has for its program of work. It's one of their most important components. Should other Indo-Pacific nations believe that this is an important priority to elevate, I can certainly see that as an organizing principle around which Indo-Pacific nations could be thinking about economic development and economic engagement, absolutely. Yeah, so there was a question, I think, about the Assistant Secretary's recent speech. I do not know to what degree the concept of pluralism will be picked up and promoted by the Trump administration. It will be interesting to see whether this is a kind of one-off speech or whether this is a topic that they are interested in taking on and promoting throughout the region. I do think that the United States, and I do think that the Trump administration is trying to make a very specific pitch across the region to ask countries to stand up for the idea of freedom of navigation, for open markets, for a kind of broad-based approach to this idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. So I think they are asking countries to, in a sense, make a choice in favor of those principles. But that's how I view the context of that speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Choong, there was a question about ASEAN and the ASEAN approach and BRI, I think.
Thanks for that. That's a great question. Let me try to answer your question by an anecdote. First of all, my short answer is that there is a general ASEAN consensus towards support for BRI, and so I'm not saying that it's untrammeled support for BRI within ASEAN, but we have done a study that out of the 10 ASEAN members, largely most of them have accepted BRI. Some of them are cautious. Some countries, like Malaysia, have asked for revisions in some of the conditions on the BRI projects, but by and large, ASEAN countries have been generally supportive of BRI for fundamental reasons that they are bringing investment capital into much needed projects. But my bigger point is that if you see how China manages the BRI, you will see a glimpse into the regional order of the future, if you like. And I'll use the anecdote of Japan. I'm part of a process between the Singapore MFA and Japan's MOFA. It's called the Japan-Singapore Symposium, and it convenes every 18 months or so. And I had a gallery seat when two ambassadors from Singapore and Japan, they slugged it out on BRI and AIIB. And basically the Japanese ambassador was going hammer and tongs on Singapore's participation in AIIB, which finances BRI. And the Singapore ambassador would say, well, you have to be part of the process, you have to be on the train. I hope it's not my comments that set the lights off. But the Singapore ambassador was saying that you have to be on the train so that you can dictate how the train moves. And the Japan ambassador said, well, you shouldn't be even getting onto the train. And that was 3 years ago. And look now at Japan. Japan is now cooperating with, the lights are back on again. Japan is now cooperating, right? And Shinzo Abe is saying that Japan on kind of 50 BRI projects, bringing Japanese governance standards, financing standards, and couple it with Chinese capital. And so you see, in a sense, from untrammeled opposition to BRI on Tokyo's part, we have a sophisticated approach where, as if you can hew to Japanese standards, then we're willing to do BRI. And I think in terms of how Westerners look at BRI, sure, there are questions about financing standards, governance standards, but the addresses a felt need in the region. I think the number is about 20 trillion of infrastructure. And if you look at that, to use a Star Wars analogy, I feel a disturbance in the force. Because China is using, this cheap, low-interest capital to lure a lot of ASEAN countries, other Asian countries into taking up BRI, and the implications we will know in a generation from now. So thank you for your question again.
I think we're out of time. Thank you very much to each of the panelists and to the audience. I can't resist this, the analogy of Star Wars, and you feel a disturbance in the force. But if one looks at another analogy, which is whether winter is coming or not, and in the tropics, and especially in Singapore, winter will never come. So I think you're quite safe there. But thank you very much for, let me thank each of the panelists for their contributions today. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am and sirs, for the interactive and engaging session. May I please request the dignitaries to remain on stage for the presentation of mementos. I request the chair for the session to please present mementos to the panelists. I would also like to invite Dr. Prabir Dey from the Research and Information System for Developing Countries to please present a memento to the chair for the session. Thank you. With this, the second plenary session of the Delhi Dialogue 11 comes to a close. We'll now break for refreshments and resume the third plenary session on regional connectivity in Indo-Pacific at 11:30 in this hall.